The desert wind carried more than dust that October night. It carried the scent of something I couldn't name. Something that made my skin crawl even before I pushed through the bat-wing doors of the Last Lantern Saloon. The hinges groaned like old bones, and I stepped into what would become my prison. My name is Jack Hawthorne, and I came to Dry Bone Gulch running from ghosts. Not the kind that rattle chains or moan in attics, but the kind that live in your memory, feeding on regret. 3 years since Gettysburg, and I still woke up tasting gunpowder and blood. The war had ended, but it never left me. I'd ridden hard for 2 days straight, my horse lathered and trembling beneath me. The job posting had been simple enough. Bartender needed, good pay, no questions asked. Perfect for a man who'd burned every bridge behind him. The town looked dead when I arrived. Shuttered windows, empty streets, the kind of silence that makes you check your gun without thinking. But the saloon was different. Oil lamps flickered against weathered wood, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of their flames. The air hung thick with tobacco smoke and something else. Something metallic that coated the back of my throat. I'd smelled it before, in field hospitals and mass graves. "You must be Hawthorne." The voice came from behind the bar, gravelly and worn. A woman emerged from the shadows, her steel-gray hair pulled back severely, eyes the color of winter storms. Maud Crane, the proprietor. She moved with the careful precision of someone who'd seen too much and trusted too little. "That's right, ma'am." I touched the brim of my hat, trying to read her face. "Ready to start tonight, if you'll have me." She studied me for a long moment, those pale eyes seeming to weigh my soul. "This ain't like other establishments, Mr. Hawthorne. We serve more than whiskey here." Her fingers drummed against the bar top, each tap echoing in the empty room. "You follow the rules, you'll do fine. Break them." She let the sentence hang like a noose. The first customers trickled in around 9. Miners mostly, their faces carved from granite and exhaustion. They drank in silence, speaking only to order another round. I poured whiskey and beer, wiped down glasses, tried to ignore the way conversations died whenever I approached. The clock on the wall ticked steadily toward midnight, its brass pendulum catching the lamplight. At 11:58, something changed. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in an instant, and my breath began to fog. The miners glanced at each other, finished their drinks in hurried gulps, and filed out without a word. Within minutes, I stood alone in the empty saloon. The silence pressed against my eardrums like deep water. I reached for the mezcal bottle on the top shelf, thinking to sample the merchandise when I noticed it. The bottle was bone dry. Had been for months, judging by the dust coating its interior. Yet as the clock struck midnight, a figure materialized at the far end of the bar. He was tall and gaunt, dressed in a faded cavalry uniform that might have been blue once. His face was pale as moonlight, eyes hollow as empty graves. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of eternity. "Mezcal," he said simply. "The good stuff." My hand trembled as I reached for the empty bottle. This couldn't be happening. Men didn't just appear from thin air, didn't order drinks with voices that seemed to come from the bottom of a well. But there he sat, patient as death itself, waiting for service that defied every law of nature I knew. I set the bottle on the bar, my mouth dry as desert sand. "Sir, I'm afraid this bottle is..." He raised one skeletal finger, and the words died in my throat. The empty bottle suddenly brimmed with amber liquid, the cork popping free with a sound like breaking bones. The scent that rose from it wasn't agave. It was something far older, far more terrible. I poured with shaking hands, the liquid catching the lamplight like liquid fire. He lifted the glass in a toast to something I couldn't see, drained it in one swallow, and vanished like smoke in wind. The bottle returned to its empty state, leaving only the lingering smell of grave dirt and ancient secrets. My legs gave out, and I collapsed against the bar, heart hammering against my ribs. This was impossible. Men didn't simply disappear. Bottles didn't fill themselves with phantom liquor. Yet the glass remained on the bar, still warm from spectral lips. I stumbled toward the back door, needing air, needing to convince myself I was still sane. The door opened onto a narrow alley, and there in the dust, I saw them. Footprints leading from the saloon to the street, but not the kind made by living feet. These were deeper, as if pressed by something far heavier than flesh and bone, and they were perfectly preserved, despite the wind that should have erased them hours ago. Time's debts come due here. Maud's voice made me spin around. She stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable. Best you learn that quick, Mr. Hawthorne. What was that thing? My voice cracked like a teenager's. A customer, she replied simply. One of many you'll be serving. She turned to go, then paused. Check under the register before you close up. There's something you need to see. I found it wedged beneath the cash drawer. A scrap of yellowed paper, its edges brown with age. The writing was faded but legible, scrawled in what looked suspiciously like dried blood. No offering, no dawn. The words sent ice through my veins. I looked up at the clock, its brass face gleaming in the lamplight. As I watched, the hands moved past midnight, past 1, past 2, but instead of stopping, they continued their relentless march. 13 chimes, 14, 15. The sound echoed through the empty saloon like a funeral bell, and I knew with absolute certainty that I'd stepped into something far worse than a simple bartending job. The last lantern wasn't just a saloon, it was a gateway, and I was its newest keeper. Sleep didn't come that night. I sat in the cramped room above the saloon, staring at the ceiling while that phantom clock continued its impossible chiming. Every hour brought 15 strikes instead of the proper count, as if time itself had been corrupted by whatever force governed this place. The blood-stained note lay on my nightstand, its cryptic message burning into my thoughts like a brand. When dawn finally broke through my window, I descended to find Maud already behind the bar, polishing glasses with mechanical precision. She looked up as my boots hit the floorboards, her weathered face betraying nothing of the supernatural encounter she'd witnessed hours before. "Coffee's on the stove," she said without preamble. "Strong enough to wake the dead, though around here that might not be wise." I poured myself a cup, the bitter liquid doing little to clear the fog from my mind. About last night. What about it? Her tone suggested the conversation was already over. That man, if he was a man, the way he appeared, the bottle filling itself. I searched her face for some sign of shared madness, some indication that I hadn't completely lost my grip on reality. Maud set down her glass and reached beneath the bar, producing a rolled parchment tied with faded ribbon. The paper looked ancient, its edges crumbling at the slightest touch. When she unrolled it, I saw 5 lines of text written in what could only be dried blood. the crimson ink still vivid against the yellowed surface. "These are the rules," she said simply. "Follow them exactly, and you might survive your first year. Ignore them." She shrugged, the gesture carrying the weight of previous failures. The first mandate was written in elegant script that seemed to shift and writhe as I read. At the stroke of 2 in the morning, place a cup of black coffee at the bar's end. Add nothing. Touch nothing. Let it be consumed in silence. "What happens if I don't?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer would be something I didn't want to hear. "The last keeper who tested that rule was found 3 days later," Maud replied, her voice flat as stone. "What was left of him anyway?" The coffee disappeared, but so did he. The second mandate made my blood run cold. When the rider in the threadbare duster arrives, serve only chilled water. Never meet his gaze. Never speak unless spoken to. He drinks only truth. How many of these visitors should I expect? My voice sounded hollow, even to my own ears. "Depends on the season," she said, rolling up the parchment. "Winter brings more. They're drawn to warmth, to life. You'll learn to recognize them soon enough." That evening, I prepared for my second shift with the grim determination of a soldier heading into battle. The miners returned as before, their silence now carrying new weight. I served them whiskey and beer, but my eyes kept drifting to the clock, watching its hands creep toward the appointed hours. At exactly 2 in the morning, I placed a steaming cup of black coffee at the far end of the bar. The liquid was dark as midnight, bitter as regret. I retreated to the opposite end and waited, my skin crawling with anticipation. The temperature dropped again, that same bone-deep chill that had preceded the previous night's visitation. A figure materialized in the chair beside the coffee. Not the gaunt cavalry officer, but something else entirely. This one wore the tattered remains of a wedding dress, her veil stained with substances I didn't want to identify. She lifted the cup with skeletal fingers and drained it in one long swallow, her throat working in ways that defied anatomy. When she finished, she turned toward me, and I caught a glimpse of hollow sockets where eyes should have been. Her mouth opened as if to speak, but only the sound of wind through empty spaces emerged. Then she was gone, leaving behind the faint scent of roses and decay. The cup remained on the bar, bone dry as if it had never held liquid at all. 3 nights passed in similar fashion. Different spirits, same ritual. A Confederate soldier missing half his face. A child in a nightgown, her skin blue with cold. An old prospector whose beard dripped with something that wasn't water. Each one drank the coffee and vanished, leaving me more shaken than before. On the 4th night, everything changed. I was wiping down glasses when the batwing doors swung open, admitting a figure that made my blood freeze in my veins. He was tall and lean, wrapped in a duster so faded and worn it might have been gray once. His hat was pulled low, casting his face in shadow, but I could see the hollow gleam of his eyes beneath the brim. He moved with the fluid grace of a predator, each step deliberate and measured. When he reached the bar, he settled onto a stool with the patience of something that had all the time in the world. The air around him shimmered with heat, despite the autumn chill. "Water," he said, his voice like gravel in a dry riverbed, "cold as you can make it." My hand shook as I filled a glass from the ice bucket, the cubes clinking against the sides like chattering teeth. I slid it across the bar without looking up, remembering Maud's warning about meeting his gaze. The glass stopped precisely in front of him, as if guided by invisible hands. He lifted it slowly, and I caught a glimpse of his fingers, or what had once been fingers. They were too long, too pale, ending in points that might have been nails or claws. When he drank, the water steamed as it touched his lips, evaporating into mist that hung in the air like a shroud. "You're new," he observed, setting down the empty glass. "The last one lasted 8 months, longer than most." I wanted to ask what had happened to my predecessor, but the words stuck in my throat like thorns. Instead, I nodded, not trusting my voice. "You'll learn," he continued, his tone almost conversational. "They all do eventually. The rules exist for a reason, boy. Break them, and you'll discover why." He stood then, tossing a coin onto the bar. It landed with a metallic ring that echoed long after it should have stopped. When I looked down, I saw it wasn't currency at all, but a piece of tarnished silver shaped like a human tooth. "Keep that," he said, already moving toward the door. "You'll need it before the month is out." As he reached the threshold, he paused and looked back over his shoulder. For just an instant, I saw his face clearly and wished I hadn't. It was human in shape, but wrong in every detail, as if someone had tried to recreate humanity from a half-remembered dream. "The coffee ritual is just the beginning," he said. "Wait until you hear the music." The doors swung shut behind him, and I was alone again with the phantom tooth and the growing certainty that I'd made a terrible mistake coming to Dry Bone Gulch. Outside, the wind began to pick up, carrying with it the distant sound of hoofbeats. But when I looked through the window, the street was empty. The hoofbeats grew louder, thundering like an approaching storm. Then, just as suddenly as they'd begun, they stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, pressing against my eardrums like deep water. I stood frozen behind the bar, the silver tooth burning cold in my palm, waiting for whatever came next. The silver tooth remained cold against my palm for 3 days, its unnatural chill seeping through my skin like winter frost. I carried it everywhere, unable to shake the feeling that it was watching me somehow, waiting for something I couldn't comprehend. The phantom hoofbeats had become a nightly occurrence, always stopping just as I worked up the courage to investigate. On the 3rd morning, desperation finally overcame my fear. I needed answers, and Maud's cryptic warnings weren't enough anymore. The town had a small library tucked between the general store and the blacksmith shop, run by a scholarly man named Jonah Blackwood. If anyone knew the truth about Dry Bone Gulch, it would be him. I found him hunched over a stack of moldering books, his wire-rimmed spectacles perched precariously on his nose. He was younger than I'd expected, perhaps 30, with the pale complexion of someone who spent more time with dusty tomes than desert sun. When I entered, he looked up with the startled expression of a man unaccustomed to visitors. "Mr. Hawthorne, isn't it?" His voice carried the refined accent of Eastern education. "I heard you'd taken the position at the Last Lantern. Brave man. Or perhaps foolish. Time will tell which." "I need to know what I've gotten myself into," I said without preamble. "The things I've seen, they're not natural. There's something wrong with this town, something that goes deeper than strange customers and phantom clocks." Jonah studied me for a long moment, then gestured to a chair beside his desk. "What exactly have you witnessed?" I told him everything. The midnight visitor with his impossible mezcal, the coffee ritual, the rider in the threadbare duster. With each detail, his expression grew more grave, more resigned. When I finished, he removed his spectacles and cleaned them with shaking hands. "You're not the first to ask these questions," he said finally. "Your predecessor came to me with similar concerns. So did the man before him and the one before that. They all wanted to understand what they'd stumbled into. What happened to them? They learned too much," Jonah replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Knowledge is dangerous in Dry Bone Gulch, Mr. Hawthorne, but ignorance is worse." He led me to a locked cabinet in the library's back room, producing an ornate key from his vest pocket. Inside were documents that looked far older than the town itself, their pages yellow with age and brittle as autumn leaves. Maps, letters, and what appeared to be official records, all bearing dates from 1880. "The founding of Dry Bone Gulch," Jonah explained, spreading the papers across a reading table. "But not the version they tell in the history books." The map was the most revealing. It showed the town's original layout, but with significant differences from the current streets. Where the last lantern now stood, the map indicated something called the Covenant Stone, marked with symbols that hurt to look at directly. The surrounding area was labeled simply as the Hungry Ground. "The first settlers weren't looking for gold or fertile land," Jonah continued, his finger tracing the map's faded lines. "They were running from something, or someone. A group of spiritualists and occultists, led by a man named Ezekiel Thorne. They believed they could commune with the dead, bargain with forces beyond human understanding." I studied a daguerreotype tucked between the documents. It showed a group of stern-faced men and women gathered around a massive stone monolith, their expressions a mixture of fear and determination. The stone itself was covered in carved symbols that seemed to writhe and shift even in the static photograph. "They made a pact," Jonah said, his voice growing quieter. "Food for protection, sustenance for sanctuary. The spirits of the desert were hungry, you see. They'd been feeding on travelers and prospectors for centuries, but the founders offered them something better, a steady supply of nourishment." "What kind of nourishment?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Life force, souls, the essence of human existence." He pulled out another document, this one written in the same crimson ink I'd seen on the saloon's mandates. The Covenant Stone was buried beneath what would become the last lantern. The document contained a list of names, each followed by a date and a single word: consumed. The entries went back decades, a steady procession of the disappeared and forgotten. At the bottom of the list, 3 names had been crossed out in black ink: Thomas Whitmore, Samuel Cross, and Marcus Reed. The previous keepers, Jonah explained. Each one lasted exactly 1 year before they fulfilled their ultimate purpose. My blood turned to ice water. "You're saying I'm meant to be sacrificed?" "Not sacrificed," he corrected. "Transformed. The keeper doesn't just serve the spirits. Eventually, he becomes one of them, the final offering that seals the pact for another generation." I stared at the documents, my mind reeling. Everything made horrible sense now. The phantom visitors, the impossible rituals, the way Maud had looked at me with such resignation. I wasn't an employee. I was livestock, being fattened for slaughter. "There has to be a way out," I said desperately. "Some loophole, some escape clause." Jonah shook his head sadly. "The pact is absolute. Break it, and the spirits will consume the entire town. Honor it, and only one soul is lost each year. The mathematics are simple, if not comforting. What about the mandates? The rules Maud gave me? Survival mechanisms, he replied. Ways to appease the spirits without triggering their full wrath. Follow them exactly, and you might last the full year. Break them. He gestured to the list of names. Well, you can see what happens to those who don't. I was about to ask more questions when a sound froze the words in my throat. Footsteps in the library's main room, slow and deliberate. Jonah's face went white as parchment, and he quickly gathered the documents, shoving them back into the cabinet. Someone's coming, he whispered urgently. You need to leave, now. But it was too late. The footsteps had reached the back room, and I turned to see a figure standing in the doorway. It was the rider from the saloon, still wrapped in his threadbare duster, his hollow eyes fixed on me with predatory intensity. Curiosity killed the cat, Mr. Hawthorne, he said, his voice like grinding stone. But satisfaction brought it back, in a manner of speaking. He stepped into the room, and I noticed that his boots left no prints on the dusty floor. Mr. Blackwood has been most helpful, haven't you, Jonah? Always willing to share the town's secrets with the new arrivals. Jonah cowered behind his desk, his scholarly composure completely shattered. I only told him what he needed to know, nothing more. Of course you did, the writer replied with mock sympathy. Just as you told the others, such a conscientious librarian, always eager to educate. He turned back to me, and I saw something that might have been amusement flicker across his inhuman features. Knowledge is power, they say, but in Dry Bone Gulch, knowledge is also burden. The question is, what will you do with what you've learned? I wanted to run, to flee this cursed town and never look back. But something in his tone suggested that escape wasn't an option, not anymore. The spirits are restless tonight, he continued conversationally. They sense change coming. The winter solstice approaches, and with it, the time of greatest hunger. You'd best return to the saloon, Mr. Hawthorne. Your duties await. As I stumbled toward the door, he called after me one final time. Oh, and Jack, when you get back, check the cellar. I believe you'll find it illuminating. I ran through the empty streets, my boots echoing off the wooden sidewalks like gunshots. The last lantern loomed ahead, its windows glowing with that same unnatural light. But as I approached, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The cellar door, which I'd never seen open before, stood ajar. Muddy footprints led down the wooden steps, disappearing into the darkness below. And from somewhere in those depths came the sound of digging, steady and rhythmic, as if someone was preparing a grave. The cellar door creaked open with a groan that seemed to echo through the very bones of the last lantern. My heart hammered in my chest as I hesitated on the threshold, the faint sound of digging growing louder, more insistent. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something far fouler, an ancient rot that clawed at the back of my throat. I reached for the lantern hanging by the door, its glass smudged and cracked, and lit it with trembling hands. The flickering flame cast long, jittery shadows that danced along the wooden walls, turning familiar shapes into grotesque parodies of themselves. The stairs descended steeply into darkness, each step groaning under my weight, as if the wood itself protested my descent. As I moved deeper, the temperature plummeted, the chill biting through my coat and settling deep in my bones. The sound of digging stopped abruptly, replaced by a heavy silence that pressed in from all sides. I strained my ears, but all I could hear was the faint drip of water somewhere in the depths below, each drop echoing like a funeral bell. The cellar opened before me, cramped and low-ceilinged, lined with dusty crates and barrels that looked older than the town itself. But what seized my attention was the monolith, a rough-hewn stone covered in strange twisting symbols that seemed to writhe beneath the lantern's glow. The carvings hurt to look at directly, as if they were burning themselves into my retinas. The air around the stone shimmered faintly, distorting like heat waves rising from summer pavement. I stepped closer, my fingers itching to trace the ancient markings, but something deep in my gut screamed warnings. This wasn't just stone. It was something alive, something watching. A sudden gust of wind swept through the cellar, impossibly cold and carrying the stench of opened graves. My lantern flame guttered and died, plunging me into absolute darkness. I fumbled for matches, my hands shaking so violently I could barely strike one. When the light returned, she was there. The bride from the coffee ritual stood at the far end of the room, her torn veil floating around her like smoke. Her wedding dress was no longer merely stained. Fresh blood seeped through the fabric, spreading in dark patches that pulsed with each beat of some phantom heart. Her hollow sockets fixed on me with terrible intensity, and she raised one skeletal hand in silent beckoning. My feet felt rooted to the earthen floor, every instinct screaming at me to run while my body refused to obey. Her mouth opened in a soundless scream, and the temperature dropped another 10 degrees. Then, cutting through the supernatural chill, came the sound of piano keys from upstairs. The opening notes of "Home on the Range" drifting down through the floorboards like a death knell. The fourth mandate blazed through my memory. When that song played, everyone had to evacuate, leaving only the lights burning. I tore my gaze away from the bride's hypnotic stare and bolted for the stairs, taking them 3 at a time. Behind me, her wails rose to a crescendo that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. The saloon above was already empty, the miners having fled at the first haunting notes. They knew the rules better than I did, understood the consequences of lingering when the spirits claimed their territory. I raced around the room, lighting every lantern and oil lamp I could find, my hands working with desperate efficiency. The piano's melody grew louder, more insistent, though no fingers touched the keys. The music box mechanism inside seemed to have taken on a life of its own, the cylinder turning with mechanical precision, while the hammers struck the strings in perfect rhythm. Shadows deepened in the corners despite my efforts with the lights, pooling like spilled ink. A chair scraped across the floor behind me, its legs leaving gouges in the wood. Then another and another until the entire room filled with the sound of furniture rearranging itself according to some unknowable pattern. I kept my eyes fixed on the lamps, refusing to turn around, but I could feel something massive moving in my peripheral vision. The presence was enormous, filling the space behind me like a living mountain. Its breathing was a sound of wind through canyon walls, deep and hollow and wrong. The floorboards groaned under impossible weight, and the air grew thick with the metallic taste of old blood and older hunger. I dared not turn, but I could feel its attention like a physical weight pressing down on my shoulders. Every instinct told me to look, to confront whatever stood behind me, but the mandates were clear. Some things were not meant to be seen, not if you wanted to keep your sanity intact. The piano's melody reached its climax, the notes hanging in the air like suspended judgment. Then, without warning, the lid slammed shut with a bang that rattled every glass in the saloon. The sudden silence was deafening, more terrifying than any sound could have been. I stood frozen in the aftermath, surrounded by flickering lights that seemed pitifully inadequate against the darkness pressing in from all sides. The presence behind me lingered for another heartbeat, then withdrew, leaving only the scent of grave dirt and the echo of something that might have been laughter. Slowly, carefully, I turned around. The saloon was empty again. The chairs returned to their proper places as if nothing had happened. But the air still hummed with residual energy, and I knew with absolute certainty that I was being watched by eyes I couldn't see. The night stretched ahead of me like an endless tunnel, each minute crawling by with agonizing slowness. I realized then that the mandates weren't just arbitrary rules. They were lifelines thrown to drowning men, the only things standing between the living and the ravenous dead. I settled behind the bar, my hands still trembling as I poured myself a shot of whiskey. The liquid burned going down, but it did nothing to warm the ice in my veins. Outside, the desert wind howled like a pack of wolves, but inside the last lantern, the silence was absolute. The weight of my situation pressed down on me like a burial shroud. I was trapped in a web of ancient forces, caught between the hunger of the dead and the indifference of the living. Every flame I tended was a small victory against the encroaching darkness, but I wondered how long I could keep them burning. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky with pale fingers of light, I sat vigil behind the bar. The spirits had withdrawn for now, but they would return. They always returned. And each night, the darkness would grow a little deeper, the hunger a little stronger. I was the keeper now, guardian of secrets that should have stayed buried. The question wasn't whether I would survive. It was how much of my soul would remain when the year was done. The weight of my newfound knowledge pressed down like a burial shroud as I prepared for another night behind the bar. Jonah's revelations about the pact and the previous keepers had shattered any illusions I might have harbored about escaping this cursed place. The cellar encounter with the weeping bride still haunted my dreams, her hollow sockets boring into my soul with accusations I couldn't comprehend. The evening began quietly enough, with the usual procession of weathered miners seeking liquid solace after another day of fruitless digging. They spoke in hushed tones, their conversations dying whenever I approached with fresh drinks. I'd grown accustomed to their wariness, understanding now that they saw me not as a bartender, but as a condemned man walking toward his execution. As the clock approached midnight, the familiar chill began to seep through the walls. The miners finished their drinks with practiced haste and filed out into the desert night, leaving me alone with the flickering lanterns and the oppressive silence that preceded each supernatural visitation. I busied myself wiping down glasses, my hands trembling slightly as I waited for whatever horror would manifest next. The batwing doors swung open with deliberate slowness, admitting a figure that made every nerve in my body scream warnings. He was tall and impossibly gaunt, his frame draped in a black suit so threadbare it seemed woven from shadow itself. His skin was the color of old parchment, stretched tight over sharp cheekbones that cast deep hollows beneath eyes that gleamed with predatory intelligence. "Good evening, Mr. Hawthorne," he said, his voice carrying the smooth cadence of a funeral director. "I trust you've been adjusting to your new responsibilities." He moved with fluid grace to the corner table, each step measured and purposeful. When he settled into the chair, it was with the patience of something that had all eternity to wait. His pale hands folded on the table's surface, and I caught a glimpse of fingernails that were too long, too sharp, more like talons than anything human. "Whiskey," he said simply. "Neat. No ice." I poured with unsteady hands, the amber liquid catching the lamplight as it filled the glass. When I set it before him, he lifted it with those unsettling fingers, but made no move to drink. Instead, he held it up to the light, studying the contents as if reading secrets in its depths. "Allow me to introduce myself properly," he continued, his gaze never leaving the glass. "Silas Crow. I serve as, let's call it, a quality assurance specialist for the arrangement your predecessors entered into." The name hit me like a physical blow. I'd heard whispers of Silas Crow in the town's darker corners, fragments of conversations that died when strangers approached. He was the collector, the one who came when debts fell due, when the pact demanded its terrible price. "You're wondering about the previous keeper," Silas observed, finally setting down the untouched whiskey. "Marcus Reed. Lasted 11 months before he tried to break the rules. Thought he could outsmart forces older than civilization itself." "What happened to him?" The question escaped before I could stop it. Silas smiled, an expression that held no warmth whatsoever. "He learned that some contracts are written in more than ink and blood. They're carved into the very fabric of reality itself. Breaking them, well, let's just say the consequences extend far beyond a simple breach of agreement." He leaned back in his chair, his movements creating no sound against the wood. "You see, Jack, may I call you Jack? The spirits we serve are not merely hungry, they are ravenous. They have been feeding on this arrangement for generations, growing stronger with each offering. To deny them now would be catastrophic." The temperature in the room dropped another degree, and I noticed frost beginning to form on the windows despite the desert heat outside. Silas seemed unaffected by the cold, his pale skin showing no sign of discomfort. "Maud has given you the mandates," he continued conversationally. "Simple rules, really. Follow them precisely, and you might survive your tenure. Deviate even slightly." He shrugged, the gesture somehow more menacing than any threat. Over the following nights, Silas became a regular presence in the Last Lantern. He would arrive precisely at midnight, order his whiskey, and settle into that same corner table. He never drank, never ate, simply sat in silent observation while the supernatural circus played out around us. I began to understand that his role was more complex than simple collection. He was a guardian of the pact's integrity, ensuring that both sides honored their ancient agreement. The spirits received their sustenance, and the town remained protected from their full wrath. It was a delicate balance, maintained through ritual and sacrifice. One particularly cold evening, Jonah joined me for what we'd begun calling our midnight vigil. We positioned ourselves in the shadows near the back door, watching as Silas performed his nightly routine. What we witnessed that night changed everything I thought I understood about the arrangement. As the clock struck 12, Silas rose from his table and moved to the center of the room. He extended one clawed hand toward the ceiling, and I watched in fascination as a glowing orb materialized in the air above him. The sphere pulsed with soft light, beautiful and terrible at once, containing what looked like swirling galaxies of energy. With practiced ease, Silas plucked the orb from the air and tucked it into his coat. The moment it disappeared, the temperature returned to normal, and the oppressive atmosphere that had filled the room dissipated like morning mist. "What was that?" Jonah whispered, his scholarly composure shattered by what we'd witnessed. Before I could respond, we heard footsteps outside. Through the window, we watched as a man stumbled into the street, disoriented but very much alive. It was Thomas Garrett, a prospector who'd vanished 3 days earlier. The townspeople had assumed he'd fallen victim to the desert or claimed jumpers, but here he was, returned as mysteriously as he'd disappeared. The implications were staggering. Silas wasn't just collecting souls, he was managing them, ensuring the pack's requirements were met while somehow preserving the lives of those who should have been consumed. It was a more complex arrangement than any of us had imagined. As winter deepened and the solstice approached, Silas's visits became more frequent, his warnings more urgent. The spirits were growing restless, their hunger intensifying with the lengthening nights. I could feel their presence pressing against the boundaries of the physical world, testing the strength of the barriers that held them in check. "The time of greatest trial approaches," Silas told me one evening, his pale eyes reflecting the lamplight like mirrors. "The winter solstice is when the veil grows thinnest, when the hungry ones press closest to our world. Your true test as keeper lies ahead." I poured myself another whiskey, the liquid providing little comfort against the growing dread. Whatever was coming, I knew it would test not just my courage, but my very soul. The cold had settled deep into the bones of Dry Bone Gulch, and the nights grew longer, darker, as the winter solstice crept closer. 3 days remained until the moment when the veil between worlds would be at its thinnest, when the hungry spirits would press closest to our realm. I could feel their anticipation like electricity in the air, crackling with malevolent energy that made my teeth ache. Silas's warnings echoed in my mind as I prepared for what might be my final test as keeper. The spirits were growing restless, their usual midnight visitations becoming more frequent, more aggressive. The weeping bride now appeared nightly, her blood-stained gown growing fresher with each manifestation. The gaunt rider lingered longer at his table, his hollow eyes tracking my every movement with predatory patience. I had spent the last few days in desperate consultation with Jonah, poring over the ancient documents and searching for any alternative to the traditional blood sacrifice. The previous keepers had all followed the same grim pattern, offering themselves to the spirits when the solstice arrived, their souls consumed to fuel the pact for another year. "There might be another way," Jonah whispered during one of our clandestine meetings in the library's back room. His scholarly composure had cracked under the weight of what we'd discovered, leaving him gaunt and hollow-eyed. "The spirits don't just hunger for flesh and blood. They crave the essence of human experience, raw emotion, shared memories, the collective weight of loss and hope." His theory was radical, untested, and possibly suicidal, but it offered something the traditional sacrifice didn't: a chance for the town to survive intact, to break the cycle of death that had claimed so many keepers before me. If we could gather the townspeople, channel their stories and emotions into a communal offering, it might satisfy the spirit's hunger without requiring a human life. The plan was audacious in its simplicity: a lantern vigil on the night of the solstice, with the entire town gathered in the last lantern to share their deepest memories of loss and survival. The collective emotional energy would be focused through the monolith in the cellar, sealed with my blood, but powered by something far greater than individual sacrifice. Convincing the townspeople proved easier than expected. The miners and shopkeepers who had watched keeper after keeper disappear were desperate for any alternative to the grim cycle. They agreed to participate, their faces etched with the kind of hope that comes only from staring into the abyss and finding even the faintest glimmer of light. The days leading up to the vigil were tense beyond description. The wind howled through the empty streets with increasing fury, rattling shutters and stirring dust devils that danced like restless spirits. I found myself watching the horizon constantly, expecting to see the gaunt rider or some new horror lurking in the shadows. Sleep became impossible, and every creak of the saloon's aging timbers felt like a warning. When the night finally arrived, the transformation was remarkable. The last lantern, usually a place of grim necessity and supernatural dread, had been converted into something approaching sanctuary. Lanterns hung from every available surface, their warm glow pushing back the encroaching darkness. Oil lamps flickered on tables and windowsills, creating pools of light that seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat. The townspeople gathered as the sun set, their faces reflecting a mixture of fear and determination. These were hard people, shaped by the unforgiving desert and the constant threat of the supernatural. But tonight they came together with a shared purpose that transcended their individual struggles. One by one, they began to speak. Sarah Mitchell, the blacksmith's widow, told of her husband's death in a mine collapse and how she'd kept his forge burning through sheer will. Old Pete Garrison shared memories of his son, lost to claim jumpers 5 years past, and how he still set a place at his table every Sunday. The stories flowed like water in the desert, each one adding to the growing reservoir of shared experience. The air grew thick with emotion, a tangible energy that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of their words. I felt it building around us, a collective spirit that transcended the individual voices. The very walls of the last lantern seemed to absorb the stories, the ancient wood drinking in the essence of human experience like parched earth receiving rain. As midnight approached, the supernatural residents of Dry Bone Gulch began to manifest. The weeping bride appeared first, her blood-stained veil trailing behind her as she drifted among the gathered townspeople, her hollow sockets fixed on me with desperate hunger, a silent demand for the offering that had sustained her kind for generations. But something was different tonight. The spirits seemed uncertain. They circled the edges of the gathering like wolves around a campfire, drawn by the emotional energy but held back by something they couldn't quite understand. The collective will of the townspeople had created a barrier of sorts, a shield of shared humanity that even the dead found difficult to penetrate. As the clock struck 12, I led the final procession down to the cellar. The monolith waited in the darkness, its carved symbols seeming to writhe in the lantern light. The townspeople formed a circle around the ancient stone, their voices joining in a low murmur that seemed to resonate through the very foundations of the building. I drew my knife, the blade gleaming in the flickering light. The cut across my palm was deep, deliberate, sending crimson droplets into the carved grooves of the monolith. But instead of my blood alone, I mixed it with oil from the lanterns above, the essence of the vigil itself becoming part of the offering. The reaction was immediate and terrifying. The spirits materialized in full force, a maelstrom of spectral forms swirling around the cellar like a supernatural tornado. Their hunger was palpable, pressing against us with the weight of centuries of starvation. But the townspeople held firm, their shared stories creating a foundation of human experience that even the dead could not ignore. For a moment that stretched into eternity, the balance hung in the air. Then, slowly, the spirits began to withdraw, not in defeat, but in something approaching satisfaction. They had tasted the offering and found it sufficient. The collective emotion, the shared memories, the raw essence of human experience had fed them in ways that simple blood sacrifice never could. As dawn broke over Dry Bone Gulch, the supernatural storm finally subsided. The townspeople emerged from the cellar, their faces pale but triumphant. They had faced the darkness together and emerged victorious, their shared humanity proving stronger than the hunger of the dead. But I knew the victory was temporary. The pact endured, and I was still bound to it as surely as the keepers before me. The spirits would return, their hunger would grow, and the cycle would continue. The only difference was that now, perhaps, there was hope for something better than mere survival. The morning sun painted Dry Bone Gulch in shades of gold and amber, its rays cutting through the lingering wisps of supernatural energy that still clung to the desert air. I stood in the doorway of the last lantern, watching the townspeople emerge from their homes like survivors crawling from the wreckage of some great catastrophe. Their faces bore the hollow exhaustion of those who had stared into the abyss and somehow lived to tell the tale. The vigil had ended, but its effects rippled through the town like stones dropped in still water. Children who had cowered in their beds during previous solstices now played in the streets, their laughter a sound I hadn't heard since arriving in this cursed place. The miners walked with straighter backs, their conversations no longer dying when strangers approached. Something fundamental had shifted in the balance between the living and the dead. Yet I knew better than to mistake this respite for victory. The spirits had withdrawn, satisfied for now by our unconventional offering, but they had not departed. I could still feel them lurking at the edges of perception, patient as desert stones, waiting for the next opportunity to feed. The pact endured, and with it, my role as keeper of secrets that should have remained buried. Maud found me there as the sun climbed higher, her weathered face bearing an expression I'd never seen before. It might have been relief, or perhaps something approaching hope. She carried a steaming cup of coffee in her gnarled hands, the aroma cutting through the lingering scent of lantern oil and something far less pleasant. "Drink this," she said, pressing the cup into my hands. "You'll need your strength for what comes next." The coffee was bitter as desert alkali, but it cleared the fog from my mind and steadied my trembling hands. "What happens now?" I asked, though part of me dreaded the answer. "Now you learn what it truly means to be keeper," she replied cryptically. "The vigil was just the beginning, Jack. The spirits accepted your offering, but they haven't forgotten their hunger. They'll test you in ways you can't imagine, push the boundaries of the pact to see how far they can bend it without breaking." As if summoned by her words, Silas Crow materialized from the shadows near the alley, his gaunt frame draped in that same threadbare suit. He moved with his characteristic fluid grace, each step measured and deliberate, carrying something wrapped in black cloth under one arm. "Congratulations, Mr. Hawthorne," he said, his voice carrying that familiar undertone of dark amusement. "You've accomplished something unprecedented. The spirits are intrigued by your innovation. They've decided to honor the new arrangement, at least for now." He set the wrapped bundle on the bar with ceremonial precision, then stepped back with the air of someone presenting a sacred relic. The cloth fell away to reveal a leather-bound ledger, its cover worn smooth by countless hands and stained with substances I preferred not to identify. "Your predecessor's journal," Silas explained, "and now your responsibility. Every keeper before you has added to its pages, recording the rituals, the visitations, the delicate balance that keeps this town from being consumed entirely." I opened the ledger with reverent care, its pages yellowed with age and filled with cramped handwriting in various hands. The entries dated back decades, a chronicle of supernatural encounters and desperate bargains that painted a picture of barely controlled chaos. At the bottom of the final page, written in Marcus Reed's shaking script, were the words, "The hunger never ends. It only changes form." Below that, in fresh ink that seemed to gleam wetly in the morning light, my own name had been inscribed. Jackson Hawthorne, Keeper of the Last Lantern, Winter Solstice, Year of Our Lord, 1883. "How long?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Until the next keeper arrives," Silas replied with that cold smile. "Or until you find another way to satisfy the arrangement. Your vigil has bought you time, perhaps even hope, but it hasn't freed you from your obligations." Maud stepped forward then, producing an ornate iron key from her apron pocket. The metal was black with age, its surface etched with symbols that matched those on the cellar monolith. When she placed it in my palm, the key felt warm despite the morning chill, as if it contained some spark of life. "The vault beneath the cellar," she explained, "where the true records are kept. The original pact, the founding documents, the secrets that even Jonah doesn't know. It's yours to guard now, along with everything else." I closed my fingers around the key, feeling its weight settle into my bones like a physical burden. The responsibility was staggering, not just for my own survival, but for the delicate balance that kept an entire town from being devoured by forces beyond human comprehension. As the day wore on, the supernatural residents of Dry Bone Gulch began to make their presence known in new ways. The weeping bride appeared briefly in the saloon's mirror, her reflection nodding once in what might have been acknowledgement before fading like morning mist. The gaunt rider's horse left fresh hoofprints in the dust outside, though no living soul had seen him pass. That evening, as I prepared for my first shift as the officially recognized keeper, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The phantom clock on the wall had stopped chiming its impossible 15 strikes. Instead, it marked the hours with perfect accuracy, as if the very nature of time had been restored to the last lantern. The first customer of my new tenure arrived precisely at midnight, but this time I was ready. I had learned the rules, understood the stakes, and accepted my role in the ancient dance between the living and the dead. When the spectral figure materialized at the bar, I poured his drink without hesitation, my hands steady as stone. "Welcome to the last lantern," I said, my voice carrying the authority of one who had faced the darkness and emerged changed but unbroken. "What can I serve you tonight?" The spirit regarded me with something that might have been respect, then lifted his glass in a silent toast. As he drank, I felt the weight of my new reality settle around me like a familiar coat. I was no longer just Jack Hawthorne, the drifter running from his past. I was the keeper, guardian of secrets, and shepherd of the supernatural. Outside, the desert wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain, a promise of seasons yet to come. The last lantern stood as it always had, a beacon in the darkness, a place where the impossible became routine and the dead found their rest. And behind the bar, lighting lanterns against the encroaching night, I took my place in the endless vigil. The pact endured, but perhaps now it could evolve. The spirits had tasted something new in our offering, a flavor of hope that might sustain them better than fear and sacrifice. Time would tell if the bargain could be transformed into something more than mere survival. For now, it was enough to tend the lights, serve the dead their nightly libations, and guard the threshold between worlds. I was the keeper of the last lantern, and the darkness would not pass.